My name is Conal O'More. I'm delighted to be here. The reason that I'm here, I can't remember, but I think I've done a few of these in the past. My day job sometimes is with Today FM. For those of you who are not from the island here, it's one of the national radio stations where I do a business program. Nothing at all to do with mental health, but I do have very, very good friends and some very happy experiences with Reach Out, where I do some work. There is a panel here, and the panel is going to not to ask questions, but maybe project. What we're doing here is, as we already said, is a hypothetical. It is the year 2030, and I did say earlier on, it is the year when there is no Donald Trump. So it is a very good year. And what we're going to do is project forward and see what in 2030 we have achieved, and most importantly, how we got there. That's the interesting one, because if we, when all of the famous sports stars say, I think isn't it called ideation? I'm sure you've seen the rugby players or the golfers, and they're swinging and they can see the ball heading there. So in this hypothetical, the idea is, what happened in 2030 and how did we get there? Now, I'm going to do this very simply for myself, because really I'm just going to absolve myself. I'm going to ask each person on my panel to introduce themselves very briefly, explain why they are here. Jennifer will be first up. Jennifer has just gone through a trauma. Jennifer found out about clamping in Dublin. But they haven't caught her yet, but we did something. Very briefly introduce yourself and a 2-minute summation of where you see what your area in 2030.
So
Please.
Hello, lovely to have you. Thank you, Conal. So my name is Dr. Jenny McMahon, and I am a psychologist working in the School of Education in the University of Limerick. So my main area is working with teachers of adolescents, so secondary school as we have it here in Ireland, and preparing them to go out and teach their subject. So we have a couple of different subjects, which is like business, PE, and music and languages. And my main area is to bring the area of youth mental health and special education to the student teachers. So I suppose in 2030, what I'd really like to see is teachers graduating with good capacity to support students, that they go out feeling confident, that they know what mental health is and how they can actually support young people in the classroom, and that they really appreciate that youth mental health and supporting that is very much part of their job, as much as it is to teach science or to teach geography. So I suppose in a very direct way, that's what I would like to see in 2030. And obviously in the broader landscape, I'd like to see a school system that's well resourced to support our young people around their mental health.
Now remember, this is 2030.
Yes.
So you have achieved
We have
this.
those amazing things in place, yes. Okay, yeah, perfect. So we have that.
Charlie.
So I'll pass it on.
Sorry, please, yeah.
Cool, I'm loving your language. We can talk later. My name is Charlie. I am a youth advocate and member of the National Youth Reference Group with Headspace in Australia. I am an enormous advocate of youth participation within the youth mental health space, and in particular youth peer support. And I guess what has become more and more obvious to me and all of the young people in my community is that as mental health literacy continues to rise and young people are starting to reach out earlier than ever before, the services just aren't coping. And so my dream is that young people will be at the forefront of service delivery through peer support, and that way we can actually reserve the clinical expertise for those that really need it, and we can shorten wait lists.
Alisa.
Thank you. So my name is Alyssa Frampton, and I'm with the Access Open Minds National Youth Council. I'm from Canada, and so we have 12 different sites, and we're changing the way that services are delivered to those 12 sites across Canada, which are in different provinces, by working in co-creation with young people and with researchers and with clinicians. And we, as part of the National Youth Council, we have a role in all of the things that we do. So going off the model, actually, that we use, and we have youth on every single part of the hiring committee, of reviewing all of the things such as confidentiality agreements. We had a big argument over we thought it was too long, and so we are part of all of those things. So in 2030, every hospital and every mental health service that's dedicated to young people have young people who are hired staff and are helping to co-create the services that are going to be working for them. So they're not just advisories. We have right now young people hired at every single hospital and service center that's working towards them, and they are actively working with all of you to create the services that they need. Yeah.
Hey, you've got some fans here. Doreen.
Hello, my name is Doreen Niemann. I work as a clinical psychologist at the Department of Psychiatry of the Academic Medical Center in Amsterdam. And I work a lot with young people, and we're forced to use the DSM to make a diagnosis. So in 2030, I hope we gotten rid of the DSM, that we have a new system.
Doreen, have you written a book about that?
Actually, I have, Connell.
I was paid to make sure that she got that out.
I'm Owen Kalaki. I work at Origin and I lead our functional recovery research there. And I guess by 2030, I hope that we've got functional recovery is such an integrated part of the services that are available to young people who need them, to the extent that, you know, if they need help staying in school or connecting to work or making that transition, that's just an everyday thing, to the point that what I actually hope by 2030 is that I'm redundant.
Now, that's an interesting idea. Don't be redundant, not yet. I'm Ian Hickey. I'm the co-director of the Brain and Mind Centre in the University of Sydney, but I'm also a National Mental Health Commissioner in Australia and the scientific director of what's called Project Synergy, using technology to transform mental health services, a large Australian government project. I'm assuming it is 2030, and me and my family, we just purchase the healthcare and the social services we want. And they're not from governments, they're not from organisations, they're actually from large international agencies. And wherever I am, sitting here in Ireland, whether I'm home in Australia, whether I'm in transit, I just get the care I want when I need it from the provider where it is, what I would call unicare. And I don't really care who's behind that. I don't really care whether it's for profit or it's not for profit. I don't really care whether it's government insured or it's not government insured. I care about the access to it whenever I need it and the quality of the service provided. And I care that I'm continuously in interaction, as I am with every other agency that I interact with, that I choose to provide information and I pay for in one way or another, directly out of my own pocket or through taxation or whatever mechanism, that it's high quality, it's accessible, and it does what I want it to do and what I need it to do. And intrinsically, it has a very strong well-being. It's not just that it's treating the individual ailments, which I have, and I've shared with many people I have many, not just treating my individual ailments, but it's keeping me in a state in which I can fully participate. I don't actually want to be redundant. I actually want to be productive. As productive in 2030 as I hope I am now, or as I was 20 years ago. So actually, it's the systems that are sitting there, and I just make the assumption that it works wherever I am actually in the world. And it works as well for me sitting in a well-developed economy as it does for someone sitting in a developing country or in other sets of settings. It's no longer controlled by or constrained by the jurisdictions or the countries or the nation states or the histories of cultures or the professions or the health systems that we all currently take for granted.
Thank you, Ian. Jordan.
I'm Jordan Byrne. From 2013 to 2017, I was part of the Youth Advisory Panel in now Jigsaw, formerly Headstrong in Ireland. I was asked to represent the voice of young people on their board of directors. Looking back at it, in 2017, I wanted to continue to advocate for a society, not just a national society, but an international society where stigma surrounding mental health, and particularly youth mental health, was practically eradicated, and it became just as normal to talk about any mental health issue that a person had as to go to your doctor and say, I have a flu. And that's what I'll be talking about this evening.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the one thing that I noticed that is not coming up are the questions. So if you guys don't ask questions, I'm going to go off, because my job is not to be asking the questions. It's your job to be asking the questions, and the questions will be popping up down below here. My background, I'm an economist. I'm interested in areas of finance, and the one thing that none of you have touched on is funding. Who's going to pay for this? Ian, there's a great quote from you. Hips and hearts are in, mouths and minds are out. Explain that.
So for those of you who don't know the Australian healthcare system, like lots of publicly financed systems, it has all sorts of arbitrary things. We are gold medal winners in Australia for things like cardiac, things that matter to men of my age, cardiac care, joint replacements, but we very poorly fund or exclude mental health and dentistry, hence minds and mouths. Totally arbitrary cultural decisions in our particular kind of systems. It's all about financing. These national systems that we have histories and cultures where the financing has largely sat around the providers of care. And what we've seen in Uberisation, in Airbnb, and all other industries is a transformation of those systems backed by finance to actually make them user responsive. And I think the whole of healthcare...
How did you get at 2030 from where we are to there?
How did we get there?
Who's paying for this?
So how we got there, we're already there. We're not worrying about how to get there. We're already there.
Ooh,
How
I like
do you
that.
get there?
We get there. So we got there. We got there by big capital coming in. So what you're seeing, what you are already seeing in 2017 is big capital trying to move into investments in healthcare and particularly actually in mental health care, because there's a classic disconnect between a large and growing understanding of the importance of that for everyday productivity and a failure to provide relevant services. So we're sitting here talking about largely government-funded, largely NGO-backed, largely small nickel and dime stuff at the periphery of healthcare. Big healthcare is hearts and hips and other sets of issues, cancer care, etc. We're trivial. We're off the end. Nobody cares about us in public financing. But big capital does, because people want to pay for well-being, they want to pay for increased productivity, they want to pay for mental health. So community demand far outstrips public supply.
Okay.
What is an economist going to do? Go get the capital to invest in it and make money.
And I buy that, and I think that's a rational explanation, and I think that makes sense to me. Jordan, there's a question that's just popped up here. Has our conception of what constitutes a young person changed? That is from Jen Treziak, I think, is how I should pronounce her name. Just before you answer that, can I just remind people that there is live streaming right around the world as you speak. So if you want to be famous, if you want to wave to Melbourne or to somewhere in Canada, you please put up your hand and ask a question. And I won't stop you from, actually, I see the questions are beginning to pop up. Sorry, Jordan, what constitutes a young person?
To me, a young person, I suppose, goes from the age that I would have been used to within Jigsaw, from 12 to 25. I think the resources that young people have in comparison to the expectations of them within society demands that people mature a lot quicker than perhaps we are able to, and that pushes a lot of undue stress on people. When in 2017, when I was finishing my master's and becoming a trainee solicitor or lawyer for the rest of the world, I had left a job that I was really interested in. I was doing a lot of good work, but I felt it was the appropriate time for me to go off and move professionally. However, I didn't have the support system there. I didn't know essentially who to talk to outside of friends. Luckily, I had a very good, close-knit group of friends that I could rely upon. I had a sense of community and camaraderie with my friends. However, in my opinion, in 2017, that should have been there in a walk-in service to provide that to me. However, in terms of how do you finance it, this is one thing that young people struggle with, perhaps, or did in 2017. Young professionals often find that they're quite stressed, and they're working well outside the remits of their work hours, and they don't have the capacity, or didn't have the capacity, to interact at the time. They didn't have the coping mechanisms, and this is where the corporate world kind of came in and said, oh, wellness programs, we'll look after your mental health. However, to be a bit cynical, wellness is all, pardon the pun, I suppose, all well and good. However, we have to realise that there is a capacity within the human experience for negative mental health, and we should embrace that, and we should not forget what it is. I think in our current perception in 2030 of young people has embraced that.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. There's a woman down at the back of the hall. You might identify yourself as well, please.
Hi, I'm Rachel Piper from Student Minds in the UK. My question kind of reflects some of the tweets that are coming up on the screen here, and it is about the privatisation of healthcare. So one of the points that you made at the beginning was about how it doesn't matter who's delivering the care. And I would argue that if we're looking at health and well-being as something that exists on a whole population, and it's about the environment in which we live in, a lot of these corporations are contributing to that negative environment. So we need to be careful about where we take our healthcare from. We need to think about that carefully. So I guess my question is, how do we address privilege and poverty, and not just poverty in developing countries, but poverty in every single country in the world? So yeah, a question on poverty, and a question on privilege, and a question on neoliberalism generally, if that's a question, but ideas.
That is a very broad question. You could probably take a couple of hours to answer that.
Well, coming from my own academic background, my own professional background, I'm not too distant from the question in terms of, yes, I'm technically a corporate lawyer, but I'm not, I haven't sold myself out, I suppose. A great academic to utilise on that would be Martin Feynman. I think one of the big things to look at is the concept of vulnerability, and the concept that we are all inherently vulnerable. People have a better capacity, some people have a better capacity to deal with inherent vulnerabilities because they can afford a privatised healthcare system, or they can afford I suppose, insurance to look after if they're sick, whereas not a lot of people do. So I think one of the things we thankfully did in Ireland in and around the 2020 mark was we conceptually looked at vulnerability, but we also brought it within the legal and political realm, and all of our public services, through that acceptance of vulnerability as a concept, and particularly with regards to mental health, changed the atmosphere. We're now one of the most egalitarian societies that there is.
Owen, when we chatted yesterday, you were relatively voluble about matters political. Where is Australia in 2030?
In 2030, I think in 2030 in Australia, we look back at 2017 with a great degree of shame, I think. Shame that we would put to the public questions that shouldn't be debated, that are just obvious and that have hurt so many people being answered. So by 2030, I think hopefully we've had a kind of a second reconciliation. You know, it's kind of an Australian sort of thing, but we've had a second reconciliation, so that we've moved on from that sort of mindset. And I guess in terms of mental health, that we have got to a point where we started off, you know, I guess what would it be now, 23 years ago, with this sort of first step towards creating an easily accessible system, which was a physical system. Headspace, it's a physical system back in that day, that as technology has come along, and I think a little bit as Ian was alluding to, that we've built on that so that it's ever more accessible. And I think one of the things that probably did lead to that change was a move to within youth mental health, to actually thinking of ourselves not as, you know, the separate groups that we are, but as one kind of almost kind of revolutionary movement, really, that's working together to keep pushing for greater access to these things. And I think that's probably how some of those changes began to come about.
So yeah, Charlie, just before that, Elisa, there's another question in here. How has youth participation changed in 2030, I presume? Do our research organisations and services partner with young people differently? Again, 2030.
Yeah. So In looking back at 2017, when I was at the IAYMH conference, I spoke to 7 different organizations who have young people who are working with them as research partners. Only 2 of those organizations, one of which was my organization that I work for, paid their young people as equal participants. Likely because they did not have the resources at the time. So now youth participation has changed. So there's a new value here in 2030 where we see them as the experts. So when in 2017 we saw people who might give us advice on cars as expert cars as consultants, or somebody who might be an expert on cancer would actually be hired as an expert cancer consultant. I've seen this many times in health consultant agencies. And so in 2030, we place that same value on young people with lived mental health experience. And so that participation really changed, because once we upped that value and saw young people as equal, equal valued experts, because we really are equal value experts, and we have since 2017, we managed to get there, and we managed to put into all of our grants and fundings, and we managed to advocate, and we fought, and we said that if we had 3 staff, we would have one that was a youth, and we would make sure that we had staff that were paid. And everybody band together, and we really advocated and fought for it, and that's where we got to where we are.
Charlie, you wanted to come in there?
Yes. I can't echo this enough. One of the biggest frustrations I feel is that pretty much every youth organisation says that youth are at the forefront of everything that we do. And I can tell so many stories of situations where young people have been at the forefront of everything that their organisation does, but the forefront means, choosing the colours in the waiting room. They are handing out pamphlets at an event. They're pulled in they're pulled into a project or an initiative once the initiative has already been decided. Why can't we pull young people in at the very beginning? Why can't we ask them, what is the community need, and how can you come up with a solution to driving the change here? One example I have that I have already spoken about today, I, with a number of my youth colleagues, have initiated an online peer support platform for queer young people at the moment in Australia. Services are really struggling to meet the demand of queer young people accessing the service at the moment in Australia because of the conversation around the postal plebiscite, which I'm sure you've all heard much about. By bringing young people together, by training them, this is one of the most important things, is giving them opportunities for professional development so that when we put them in the professional space, they can actually advocate. By giving them that training, by supporting them with clinical support, our young people are actually alleviating the clinical demand that the Headspace programs are struggling to meet, and they're actually providing young people with what they need so often, which is validation, affirmation, and a sense of community. And I think by being able to identify the young people that really need clinical support and the young people that need validation, affirmation, and a feeling that they belong and that they're accepted in a space where there's no fear of non-acceptance and judgment, that is really powerful. So we need to go beyond consultation, and we need to start asking young people what their ideas are for the solutions.
Thanks, Charlie. There's a gentleman down at the back there who's been very patient. You might identify yourself again, please.
Hello, my name is Joshua Calarino. I'm currently the president of Youth Move National back in the United States. It's a pleasure to be acquainted with you all. I've been sitting back here and I'm stewing with questions. I have about 30 or 40, but I'll limit it down to one just for the sake of time.
You keep them coming.
So, in my experience at least, I've found that in a lot of impoverished area, which we spoke about briefly earlier, and even in more modernized area like myself from Miami, mental health seems to have a major stigma behind it. Even in a professional setting, I've experienced it with certain therapists here and there. Not all therapists. Therapy is amazing, I promise. But some therapists seem to, when they hear about a diagnosis, seem to already be upset with youth. And as a peer who I work for, I represent youth, I seem to have frustrations with some certain adults who don't seem to quite understand youth culture and things like that. And that, on top of the fact that in impoverished areas they don't even know about mental health to begin with, I guess my question here is, what do we all here in this room plan to do about mental health as a whole? Not just youth mental health, but mental health as a whole, within the fact that a lot of people don't understand mental health quite yet. And I think if we can address that fact from the get-go, we won't need to worry about youth mental health or adult mental health. It'll all just be mental health, and we can just get everything done tomorrow instead of in 2030. So how would we address that?
Jennifer, I think that sounds like it could be you.
Well, speaking from education point of view, I feel that in 2017 we've already made a lot of progress. In 2030 we might be in a situation where people feel confident that they can access mental health when and where they need it. But I think in 2017 we have achieved an awful lot in terms of reducing stigma, in understanding mental health, particularly in the education sector. We've done work which shows that teachers are actually have very positive attitudes towards supporting young people around their mental health. They want to do it, they see it as part of their role, there are tensions within that, but they still feel like they don't have the capacity to do it. They don't feel confident, they don't have the skill set to something they want to do. In 2030, what we want and what we've seen coming through in those intervening years is people having skill-based programs to move past the fear-based issues, which I think relates a lot to the stigma. People fear what they don't feel confident in dealing with. And for a lot of teachers, they push that away and leaving young people feeling a bit unsupported. 2030, I think we see a difference. People are feeling confident about supporting it. And when you have support, you have better outcomes.
Doreen, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, certainly, because, well, in 2030 we don't have the DSM anymore, so there is room to see mental health problems on a spectrum, that we're all in it. So we're probably all sometimes depressed, and sometimes people are very depressed, but it's not like people with mental health problems are different from everybody else. So I think that would be a step forward, that we don't think in categories anymore, but more in dimensions or spectra. And also, I think after this conference, there was a revolt of the young people who said, "Well, we don't want this system anymore." And so together, it's possible to make a change. So perhaps this conference can also have a good role in changing things.
Okay, now, but there are a couple of questions coming in here from the floor. Sorry, just before I come to you, may I just ask this one here? I mean, do we overcomplicate mental health service delivery? Somebody feels very passionate about that. Ian?
Hopelessly. We're a hopeless cottage industry of overly complicated by diagnosis, by profession, by subgrouping, child, youth, specialty schools, universities, who works in the NGO sector, hopelessly overcomplicated. All of those other inefficient economists, inefficient use of capital, inefficient use of human resources. I can see tweets running around. The jargon of today, the politics of today, of neoliberalism versus collectivism, and these are 2017 stuck concepts. They're very important because of the inclusiveness kind of sets of issues. When I talk about big capital, I'm not just talking about private capital, or what even's called private and public in different countries means different things. The biggest investor of capital at the moment in Australia is actually publicly financing in technology capital for the common good. It doesn't all mean individual purchasing. We're a cottage industry. So we have to answer the economic question. So in 2030, because I reckon it's all fixed, it's been fixed by economists. It's fixed by the financing. How do we go to scale? We have lots of good ideas stuck in little cottage things that are not helping the great majority of people in the developing world. They're not helping the great majority of people in the developed world. And yet people are tied to them as if they're ideologically pure, but I'd say they're publicly hopeless. So the issue is, how do we seriously engage with the economic discourse which does determine, and it's not a personal neoliberal individual discourse, that is so hopelessly 2017. It's a collectivist thing, but we have to know with the economists, what's been the world economic system that has happened in between time? And I would say, historically, it is, in a global world, it's the movement of capital to respond to need at scale. And we won't have these silly, ridiculous individual industries that we have now, where everyone does their own little thing, their own little journal, their own little publication, their own little service, their own little thing for their profession or their group, which is really hopeless on a world scale.
Gentlemen, here, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Howes. I'm a psychologist. I work in Norfolk in the UK. In 2013, we've heard about how we don't have the DSM anymore. We've heard about how we
2030, we're going forwards, not backwards.
Sorry.
There's enough backwards here already, we're going forwards.
It's just wishful thinking, sorry. So we don't have the DSM anymore. We've got a service that's designed to help us and help young people think about wellness, think about flourishing, think about doing good things in their lives. What does the panel have? What more ideas does the panel have about actually what that framework looks like? What is it that young people relate to? What's the framework that they have to help them understand not how not to be ill, but how actually to be well, how to be flourishing, how to live contented and fulfilling lives?
That's a very fair question. Who'd like to take that? Charlie, you want to come in here? Good.
I feel like one of the biggest issues at the moment in Australia, and again I'm talking Australia, it might be different elsewhere in the world, is that we've had so many massive national awareness campaigns targeting stigma reduction and awareness of the issues, and we've done a really good job at bringing young people to recognise what those things look like. But what we haven't done is educating those young people what to do when they experience those things or when they feel those things. So I think something that I have been exposed to is mental health first aid, teaching young people the skills to actually identify, recognise and respond when these symptoms come up. And I think it's really important that there is a focus on responding rather than just awareness.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that. I think that's a really good point that kind of builds on what I was saying earlier. I agree. I think in 2030, I think there's a focus on self-reflection and self-awareness. People understand, what are the positive feelings, what are the negative feelings. They know where to go for help. I suppose we will never move away from having those structures. I mean, 2030 is not a utopia where you have no mental ill health or you have no supports or services. 2030 is about it's a place where you can understand your feelings. You know what to do when you have those negative feelings. You feel supported. You feel connected. You have qualified adults who understand where young people are coming from, who are there to support you when you need it, informed all the time by young people's voices. I think that's where we're at in 2030. I certainly don't see a time when we won't need those things.
Elisa, can I ask you a question? 2030, have we got rid of stigma?
So thank you for the question. And I think that actually we have got rid of stigma, but we didn't do it by trying to raise a stigma campaign, actually. We didn't have a national campaign in Canada to get rid of that stigma. So in 2030, we did get rid of stigma, but the way that we did it was actually by putting our efforts into making sure that there were services available so that every young person would have a service that they would be able to access. Once we put that in place, which we did by advocating to our government for funding, by advocating to every source that we could, and we all fought like hell to make sure that we could get the money to do it, and we did it. We ran a national campaign. All of Canada got involved in it, and because they were involved in sending funds and raising funds and helping to supply the funds to do this and advocating for it, they felt a sense of ownership. So because they felt a sense of ownership, they helped push this forward. So now we had these community centers, and because people and Canadians were talking about mental health services and bringing them to communities and making sure that they were accessible and that it happened, we inevitably had a conversation about mental illness and what it is and what it looks like and how you identify it. And that way, we removed stigma because we opened up centers, we made sure that there were places and people are able to go there. And I think right now in Canada, we're seeing a lot of focus on the word stigma, and it's very much so seen that if you just encourage people to talk, if you encourage people it's okay to not be okay, we're really good at telling people that, but we're not really good at telling them, well, where do you go when you actually aren't okay? And we're not really good at making sure that there's a service that's actually going to really be there and that there's going to be a door that they can walk in through. So we actually are raising a lot of awareness, and we're then having kids and young people who are shut down because it's a 6-month wait time, but it's okay to talk and you can have somewhere to go. So yeah, then that creates another layer of stigma. So I don't think we'll ever eradicate stigma until we use the services. So in 2030, we have gotten all the services and then the stigma was eradicated.
I think that answers that. Karen.
So it's 2030. And you've got all these amazing youth mental health services. My daughter wants to attend your services, so I want to know 2 things. How does she access your services in each of your countries? And then the second thing is, and when she gets there, what's she going to get? So 2017, I know exactly what you get. 2030, I want to know how amazing this all is.
Who wants to take that? Ian.
Sure, no worries. She gets exactly what she needs. So you and her put in what the situations are, you give a full description of things, and you get the range of professionals and related social services that are entirely specific to your situation, where you are, come to you in times that suit you. Whether it actually costs you personally or not will depend entirely on what the arrangements are in different places, but I would suggest at rather low or perhaps no actual cost to you. The idea then obviously is that you will simply be the payer, I think, will have disappeared in the way that we come to organise big services, big human services in a different way. And then as you go on that particular journey, those systems will respond immediately as to whether she's responding to the particular services. Are they meeting your needs? Are they delivering the functional outcomes? It'll all be about the outcome and the responsiveness to your set of needs. And it won't be about which brand it's under or what its inclusion criteria are, or does she have an eating disorder or a psychosis or something else, or is she in a particular age brand, or is she in a particular place. It'll be about what is it you need? Right, we will provide the sets of professionals and sets of services at that point and track the outcome of that. The payment systems that sit behind it will be much more sophisticated. They won't be this dumb payment systems that we have now. Funding, I would like to dissent from the funding. We've got an example where funding goes in that does not deliver better services. So all the advocating in the world for simply more money does not necessarily deliver for the end user a better service. In fact, in most of our countries, under our so-called collectivist, our very well-minded, are the British still in the room? I offended the British this morning, I don't want to do it again. Under the UK NHS or under the Dublin systems or under the Australian Medicare systems, actually you put more money in, guess what? More privileged people get more services. They're not universal at all. And simply we have to be very careful, I think, while advocating for disadvantaged areas, and no doubt that mental health is significantly disadvantaged areas, that actually putting more money into the existing systems will somehow equitably get distributed and deliver quality is a myth. So at the same time we're arguing for money, we have got to be arguing in 2030 we'll have them because they won't have been designed by us. They'll be designed by people and technologies that are smarter than what we are currently using.
Jennifer, one of your areas of speciality is e-health, I understand. By 2030, oh, that's down here. Oh, who here is big on e-health?
Can I just say one quick thing to Karen? I mean, in 2030, I'd like to see a young person not having to be brought to a service by their parent, that they get picked up in school, that this gets identified before the young person even has that sense that it's an issue, so that, they don't have to be brought along to a service, that the service are integrated within the school system.
Is there an expert in e-health in the audience? No. Because my question, and I'll throw it out here to see if there's an answer, for the layperson like myself, at 2030, are there mental health services being delivered successfully, completely, wholly online?
For sure.
It's not the goal. It's not the goal. It's a misunderstanding. I think you're a bit stuck in 2017. That distinction's entirely disappeared, and you see it replicated here in many of our countries, in New Zealand and other countries. We see this e-health development as one thing, going on and over there's traditional services, and usually planned by blokes about your age who see the world as split into those two things, online and offline, and oh dear, my God, the whole thing's going to go over there, and it'll lose the human touch, it won't be the same. The world will have ended as you know it, because it already has. People are already living their lives with the total integration, in fact, of the technologies within the different levels. So the issue would be, depending on the nature. So your question about e-health is very good, about not just e-mental health, the way in which healthcare is already being transformed in aged care, early childhood services, by the integration of technologies into those areas. So the complexity of healthcare is the thing that will drive the big capital movements, because we can't rely on the same kind of hospitalisation, interventional kind of things. Not only are they not affordable, they're not what people want.
Ian,
so the other issues
you're
of
capitalist.
Choice. Oh, sorry?
We're getting a lot of pushback here on the neoliberalism.
This is such a 2017 discussion. What will be called in 2030?
In 2030, are we pushing for free services funded by the taxpayer? There should be no profit in mental ill health, or are we, somewhere else?
I'd suggest that the funding of healthcare worldwide, this is the debate, and it's not tied up in this neoliberal, private versus public, fee for service. When people are talking about the way in which health is capitalised in the future, the economists, I say this, some people may know this, Alan Fels is the chairman of, has been, the National Mental Health Commission in Australia. He's an economist with a daughter with schizophrenia. We leave the commission meetings and go and talk economics. Because all the healthcare people go, what is wrong with you people? You all believe in centrally provided, planned healthcare, which like all other central systems has failed hopelessly. What you've got to do is create the environment in which people thrive. Mm-hmm. And systems develop that thrive, that are inclusive, that are economically productive, so people will invest in them. Public money, private money, as you call it, and what you call public and private in one country is not what it's called in another country. But they'll do that on a global basis where there's a return. You think about what is happening in China and in India with the development, the investments that all of us want to make individually, but also collectively in education and healthcare, because they're the two big things that we all value. And so the sort of debates that we have in these things, and people get very worked up about this neoliberal versus this private versus this public, it's not really, we're not really part of that world. I mean, the fact you have to apologise for being corporate or something, it's dumb. It's dumb. We exist in economies in which there's all sorts of trading all the time. I think the problem is that we are all not conversant enough in the way in which economics is a profound influence on our lives and how to be part of that in a really productive way.
This lady here, she's been very patient. Thank you very much. There's a question here from the floor, please.
Hi, my name is Brittany Dolphin. I'm from Access Open Minds. Mental health is a huge issue for impoverished areas. How are we going to offer accessible, affordable, and appropriate care for youth in this demographic? And how does a privatized mental health system do anything other than keep poor people from accessing the services they need?
That kind of Ian.
Can I tell a story? Our best work at the moment is in Colombia in South America, right? And it's all about using technology to take to the poorest people through national government's investment in broadband, in iPads, in health, in education. The notion that the second part of your question intrinsically assumes privatised as distinct from how is it you actually do these in the most accessible ways and who invests in that becomes the real issue. And it is actually the poorest, most disadvantaged who actually have the most to gain.
Everybody, sorry, Doreen, do you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to say. Well, I also think it's very important that people with lived experience are talking to other people who have the same experience, because they usually understand themselves very well, each other very well. And of course, e-health is important, but I think human contact will always be important for everybody. So I think mixture would be best, and also to have lots of young people who have had difficulties and are a bit further. They can help other young people. So I think that is also very important. Of course, they have to be paid for their role. I'm certainly think that is also very important.
Can I show some favouritism here, because there's a question that's just popped in here from Nisha. Nisha's a pal of mine. I have to declare that. What did we learn from technologies that failed in the delivery of mental health services? I presume, where's Nisha? Have we got Nisha in the house? She was here earlier on. Is that this is 2030. What did we learn from the technologies that failed? Who wants to take that? Come on.
I think that what we learned on the journey to 2030 from the things that failed was how to do things better. And I think one of the things that we probably started to do was to get away from the very traditional models of research that we had, which took years and years and years on small sample sizes of people to find things with very small effect sizes, which really couldn't be translated into anything useful for anyone because they were done in such ideal circumstances. And what we learned to do was to actually put things out in the real world, get large data sets that could tell us about very small changes, and we learned very quickly to adapt those and then to test them again as we went along, so that we could actually not have to go through this whole process. And again, one of the things that's probably unfortunate for that was it saw the demise of a number of journals because they stopped accepting that kind of research. But it's actually the sort of research that will probably make the difference about things and will help us to learn a lot from the things that fail along the way. In fact, we'll actually start to see failure as a necessary part of the development process. I can't remember who it was. Somebody said to me much, much earlier in my life that there's a disturbing number of positive results in this sort of mental health journals. It's everything we do works, and that's suspicious.
Thanks, Owen. This gentleman here.
Hi. So throwback to back in...
You might identify yourself,
2000. My name is Ross. It is the year 2030. So back in 2017, Ireland, as well as all of the countries that you represent today, signed up to the UNCRC, the Children's Rights Convention. And in that, it kind of lists everything that we should be doing for our young people. And back in 2016-17 in Ireland, we were looking at the ways that our state is not being compliant to the CRC. So there's a whole host of things like protection from abuse and neglect, and having the child has the right to have their voice heard in any matter concerning them. And in some of the services in Ireland, they were sending young people abroad because we didn't have beds, or we didn't have the services or the specialisation. We weren't actually supporting their families to go and visit them if they were sent abroad. We had 2,000 young people that were on a waiting list to seek any kind of care, so to speak to anyone about their mental health issue. And we were doing loads of messed up stuff. There was something else that we were doing that was really messed up that is gone because it was so long ago. But I'm just wondering, how was it that were we threatened with a class action against the state? Was it the people of Ireland that threatened to sue us based on all the failings of Ireland? Was it the UN that came after us? Like, how was it that we changed from being, yeah, well, if we're talking about neoliberalism, we might as well talk about a lawsuit.
Okay, Jordan, that sounds like you, the corporate lawyer.
Well, first and foremost, we actually introduced class actions into Ireland. In 2017, we didn't really have the capacity for them. Our courts were overbooked, and long waiting lists existed in the court service as well, so we couldn't actually take action per se, legally speaking. However, the collective of society banded together and put immense political pressure, more so than ever had been done in the history of the state, considering that I think it was in the 1960s, so to throw back yet again from even further past 2017, that there was a lot of people who had mental health difficulties who were involuntarily incapacitated in prisons or services like that. And we stepped away from those kinds of institutions, and it took us a long road to get to where we were in 2017. Thankfully, the public pressure on the political system had changed the narrative, I suppose, to make it more accessible. I think technology as well, the integration with AI, further AI and tracking and trends, and being able to analyse that, the ability to pop on a headset as it was in 2017, now integrated into this wonderful holographic demonstration that we're all here today. Like, I'm actually in China, for example. So I think that allowed us to integrate our services a lot more, and that reduced our waiting list. I know, my hand's going right through you. But I think that allowed us to reduce the physical waiting list quite a lot, because you could get access to those services a lot easier. It became more accessible. I think in terms of the corrections that happened in terms of people being sent abroad and whatnot, like everything in the Irish capacity, it was very difficult to get effective reparations in that, in terms of the state openly admitting wrongdoing or things that were, shall we say, a bit untoward in that capacity. But we eventually got there once we put enough pressure on them. But I don't think small groups, as loud as our voices can be, are as loud as they can potentially be when they're in a collective, and a massive collective as in the entire nation, and then which transpired globally, which led to where we are now in 2030.
Thank you, Jordan. I just want to pick up because we're going to run out of time. Lady in blue, quick question, please. And you might identify yourself as well, please.
I'm Marina Politis. I'm a youth advisory panel member for Jigsaw Dublin City. So how can we ensure that in encouraging the conversation surrounding mental health and breaking down the stigma, that everybody's involved, and that by making all these advances by 2030, that the areas that do have less aren't left even further behind, so that it's not like kind of with the normal healthcare where there's such a massive gap, that we can work on that now, not when we're already so far ahead, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Charlie, that sounds like you. Okay, sorry, Lisa. Sorry.
Actually, I think that what happened in 2017 was that all of the attendants who were at the International Youth Mental Health Conference took that away with them, and actually started to push for that, and started to talk about that, and started to go back to all of we have a lot of coverage here of hospitals and service providers. You can all be advocates in your spaces to say, we're not doing good enough. We got to get out there. We got to work with these young people. We've got to figure it out. It's going to be messy. We've got to find the young people in these certain areas. We've got to, this area is, underserviced. You have to identify it. You need to do the work. And then you know what? It's going to be messy, but you're going to all have to get out on the ground and work towards it. And it's not going to work. Not one of us can make it happen, and not anybody can make it happen. It's going to have to be on every single person in this room to push it for 2030, and that's how we got there.
Okay, sorry. This gentleman here has been waiting a long time. I'm sorry. It's about to come. There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, I'm Tom. In 2030, will we still have drugs? We still have SSRIs, just a handful of drugs for psychiatric conditions that can be pretty inspecific and insensitive. Or will we be able to have technologies that can sort of read our thoughts and feelings and then be able to program, much more powerfully our, I don't know, states?
Interesting question. Who wants to take that one? Drugs or not? Or have we fixed DNA things? Or who's medically literate who would be able to answer that?
Was. Yeah. Of course we will. Yeah. No problem. Fixed. Finally, neurotechnologies, including the use of technologies rather than the pharmaceuticals, which are based on pretty simplistic biological cellular models, will have been replaced by highly personalised neurotechnologies. That is certainly the aspiration. And in 2030, assume we succeeded, that's how we got there. By actually the incorporation of very much information technologies rather than just classical biological technologies, which have dominated neuroscience for the last 20 years. So I think the big investments, you see it in Europe, you see it in North America, you see it elsewhere, in the extent to which personal, emotional, cognitive and other states can be understood better by understanding information technologies and the data sciences that sit around that is a very important kind of set of issues. So key investments were made really have been made from 2010 through to 2020 in actually the application of those things. So that by 2030, we are in a situation where personally you're able to see the benefits that might be derived by various sets of manipulations, technological, pharmaceutical, personal strategies.
Lady down here, very briefly. We're almost out of time.
Maximum benefit, minimum side effects.
Hello everyone, my name's Emma. I'm also with Access. I'm a youth council member. My question is a bit broader than just mental health resources. I'm thinking about how in 2030 I hope every single human who needs one has access to an abortion. This is a risk factor for a lot of women and a lot of people who are pregnant and can't access it. I know it isn't legal here in Ireland. And I'm just wondering, how are we going to work towards that in 2013? In 2013, are we going to ensure in every single country we have access to the resources we need outside of mental health? Are we going to make sure that everyone's taken care of in terms of the risk factors? How are we going to get there as a global community?
Well, I think I'm
Jennifer,
probably
yep.
best placed to pick up on the Irish situation where we don't have it currently in Ireland. And we actually have just done some research which looked at political disenfranchisement in relation to this issue, well-being and risky sexual behaviour. And what we've seen is where you have disenfranchisement, you have reduced well-being and greater risky sexual behaviour. So I think a lot of people in Ireland are currently recognising the need, and how we get there is through what we are seeing in action, much like the marriage equality referendum. Young people to the fore, really, this new generation coming through and seeing what needs to happen in relation to this situation, and really pushing the conversation and challenging older people to think about why they believe what they believe. And so we're going to have a referendum in Ireland before 2030, and I believe it's going to be a yes.
Okay, listen, we are out of time, so I want to give a big round of applause to our futurologists. Jennifer, Charlie, Elise, Doreen, Owen, Ian and Jordan. And again, thank you very much for your own participation. Do remember to vote. Proxy voting forms outside, because I know you guys will not make the 8 a.m. meeting. Do enjoy your hospitality in Ireland for those of you who don't live here, and have a lovely evening here. And thank you for joining us. Okay, thank you.